Let me ask you a question. How do you finish your sleeves? And I'm not talking about the underarm seam that's straight. I'm talking about the armhole seam that is nice and round that you had to gather to get it in there in the first place. Are you drawing a blank? Yeah, me too. I totally didn't know how to finish my sleeve when I was working on a dress over the weekend. So today I'm sharing some different sleeve finishes that I've found that I think will work and ones I've used in the past which don't. So keep watching. Hi, I'm Tony, and this is So Lounge. Now, I am fortunate that I have a huge library of sewing books of all the years that Grandma sewed and other ones I've picked up at half price books. And I went through all of them to try and find the best way to finish the armhole seam of a sleeve. And let me tell you, there's not a lot of information out there on this subject. I started with my Bishop Method of Sewing books. I've got 6 different titles that span from like the late 50s all the way into the 70s, and I thought they should have something. There should be some information in here. And unfortunately, their big suggestion for finishing the armhole of a sleeve was to pink the edges. And I don't know about you, but I don't really love pinking as a seam finish. I don't think it looks great. I think it looks very kind of homemade, and that's not the look I'm going for. Plus, it always ravels. I know it's not supposed to, but if you've picked something and you go wash it, it's going to start raveling. It's just always been my experience, regardless of the type of fabric I've used, because that's something I used to do back in college when, I didn't have a serger, I didn't know what I was doing, and it needed to be finished quickly. So that is not something that I ever want to do. And I had to keep looking. So I found another suggestion that you could do a zigzag stitch inside the seam allowance and then trim back to that zigzag stitch. And I went through my garments and I found the red queen or queen of hearts jacket that I made with grandma. This is Tula pink fabric. Grandma helped me put the sleeves into this so they are beautiful and perfect. Grandma suggested the same thing. She said just zigzag stitch inside of the seam line and then trim it back and then, press that seam towards the sleeve and you're good to go. And it works, but it doesn't look great. This has been washed. And it's probably only been washed like twice. And it's already kind of ravelly and frayed, looking a little bit messy along that armhole. And I don't love it. So then I found another suggestion of do a double row of stitching and then trim back to that, which I realized I did when I made this jacket. And it works as well, just like the zigzag stitch. And like the Queen of Hearts jacket, this jacket has also been washed and it's starting to have a little tiny bit of ravel on the edge, which just doesn't look great. I mean, it's not going to come apart. I'm not going to lose the sleeve, but it just doesn't look as pretty as I would like it to. And I've kind of reached this point where I want the inside to look as pretty as the outside does, especially when it comes to my Liberty fabric. And I love this dress and I worked really hard on it. And I want the sleeves in the armhole to look really nice, really pretty. And as a result, I haven't finished them because I didn't know what to do. And that is what prompted the search for the perfect sleeve seam finish. Now, some people suggest that you should do a French seam in a curved sleeve that you have to ease in. That totally terrifies me. I have enough trouble getting that sleeve in without the puckers, and there are a couple of little puckers in this. I'm not going to pretend like there weren't. There are. That's enough stress than to try and figure out how to do that in reverse, because then I'm going to turn it into a French seam. So that is not an option for me. I am not that bold. I am not that confident in my sewing, and it just seems like it's going to really stress me out a lot more than it needs to. So that is not an option either. But I did find some options that I think are reasonable depending on the type of sleeve you are putting in and how you want the end garment to look. The first book I found that actually had a specific "this is how you finish an armhole seam" instruction in it was the Golden Hands Complete Book of Dressmaking from 1972. I think this was one of my grandma's books. I don't remember buying this one at Half Price Books, but it's a really cool book and it takes you step by step through putting in a flat felled seam to finish the armhole seam. So to get started, I made a bunch of these little half bodice tops off of a pattern I already had. So I am using a 5/8 inch seam allowance, which I think makes this a lot easier. So this is how it actually is going to look in a regular commercial pattern. Obviously, if you're using an indie pattern and have smaller seam allowances, it's going to be a little bit different, but I think this will get the point across. So I have my sleeve put in. This is not a heavily eased in sleeve. It has a slight ease. I did put it in, take out that basting stitch, and then I did press the seam allowance towards the sleeve side of the armhole. So with the flat felled seam, what I'm going to do is trim back the seam allowance on the bodice side, on the shirt side, to about 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to take the sleeve side seam allowance, fold it to the stitch line that we have in place, and then fold it again, and then sew in that flat felled seam. So this stitch will be visible from the outside of the garment, and it may not be perfect for everything you want to sew because it's going to show. But I'm going to try this out. I'm going to show you how this works. I've not done this before. I thought I'd give it a shot, and we will decide together which seam allowance works best and which one looks the best. And maybe all three will work out perfectly, and it will just depend on the fabric we're using and, how the garment's going to look and what the end result is going to be as to which one, you want to choose. And, I'll make a decision about which one is going to work best for finishing the armhole of my Matisse Liberty dress. To get started, trim that armhole seam on the shirt side down to 1/4 inch all the way around. Next, I'm going to fold the sleeve side seam allowance towards the stitch line of the armhole, and then I'm going to double fold it towards the shoulder seam. I pinned over my flat felled seam, and then I gave it a quick press. The next step is to do some basting to hold that in place. I'm going to be stitching along the fold line to put in that second stitch line, and so I'm just going to baste it kind of down the middle to hold it in place and to keep the sleeve fabric away from that seam so it doesn't get caught. You can see my basting stitches here in the middle. I have my folded edge right at this slot here in my presser foot, and I move my needle over 1 notch, so it's about 1/8 of an inch over from where it normally is. And then I'm just going to pull this apart as I start stitching to finish this edge. The flat felled seam turned out really well. It looks very nice. You can see the tiny white stitch line from the outside, but I think that if I had used the blue that would match the fabric, it would be a lot less noticeable. And I think if I was using a heavily printed fabric, you probably wouldn't even notice it at all. So let's take a look at it from the inside. You can see how neatly encased the seam is. It looks very professional from the inside. And I'm happy with the way this turned out. Now, this type of sleeve finish is probably better for a little bit heavier fabric. You might want to trim the bodice or the shirt side seam a little bit less than 1/4 inch, maybe closer to 1/8 of an inch, to reduce a little bit of that bulk. But it is a very neat and tidy seam finish that I will definitely keep in the rotation moving forward. The next two seam finishes come from the Vogue Book of Sewing. It's the revised edition. I got it from my friend Janelle. It was her mom's book, so I was super happy when I opened it up and found the information I was looking for. There are a whole bunch of different seam finishes shown with little illustrations and how to do them in this book, which makes it a great reference. But there are two in particular that I think would work very well for the armhole seam. Now, the first is what they're calling a mock French seam, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. We are going to fold the edges of the seam allowance in towards itself, pin it, and then we're going to go put a stitch line along that outside edge to finish the seam. So it looks like a French seam, but you don't have all the angst of having to try and make a French seam and ease in your sleeve at the same time. Before we get started, we are going to trim out these seam allowances from the shoulder seam and the underarm seam to reduce the bulk once we start folding. This one's already cut. Reduce the bulk here. And that's just going to make sure that we have a cleaner folding experience. So now that those are trimmed out, this is the easy part. We're just folding the fabric down towards the seam on both sides, getting it as even as possible. And then we're just pressing those seams together. I'm going to put a pin in there and then work my way around the entire armhole seam. To start sewing the mock French seam, or faux French seam as I like to call it, I'm lining up my fabric with the inside edge of the presser foot so that my needle is about 1/8 of an inch away from that finished edge. And then I am just slowly making my way around to stitch the two folded pieces in place. From the outside, the faux French seam is not even noticeable, so let's take a look from the inside. If I had not used the black thread, this would not even be noticeable. It is a very neatly enclosed seam. You can see the edge opening where it looks like a faux French seam, and it turned out very well. It looks very nice. This would probably be a good seam finish for a lighter weight fabric. This is a cotton, it's kind of a heavier weight, probably closer to like a heavy muslin. I'm not sure exactly what this fabric is, but it's definitely heavier, so there is some bulk with that faux French seam in there being folded that many times that it's kind of, I mean, it still looks nice, but it's kind of a bulky seam allowance. I think in a lighter weight fabric it would work better. The third seam finish for the armhole that I'm trying out today is a turned under self-enclosed seam. So this is going to be kind of similar to the flat felt seam in that I'm going to be trimming the shirt side seam down. I'm going to do it to about 1/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to turn the sleeve side seam allowance in on itself and kind of roll it and then pin it to the remaining part of the armhole seam right next to the stitch line that is for the sleeve that's holding it together. So it's going to be sewn inside of the seam allowance, but very, very close to the actual stitch line that we originally put in to hold the sleeve in place. I'm just trimming very close to the stitch line. This is about 1/8 of an inch away, and I'm just going around to cut off the shirt side or the bodice side seam allowance so that we'll be able to turn the other side of the seam allowance in and enclose the seam. I'm going to trim out the shoulder seam allowance just to reduce the bulk for the folding part, just like I did with the flat felled seam. To fold the seam, I'm just going to kind of roll it towards the edge and then fold it again so that it's right next to the stitch line. This is very tiny and it takes some getting used to this rolling method, but I'm going to put in a pin and then make my way around the rest of the armhole and trying to keep it as even as possible. Moving on with the turned under self-enclosed seam, I have it all pinned. It's very stabby. I think that if I did this again, I would not trim it down quite so short to 1/8 of an inch. I'd leave it at 1/4 of an inch. I think that would make it a little bit easier to turn, but I am going to get this all lined up and stitch very, very close to the seam line while still staying inside of that seam line. So that's my plan for this, and we'll see how well that ends up working. So I have the outside edge under the right side of my presser foot, and my needle is lined up just inside of the fold we just made. I am stitching inside of the seam allowance, so I'm being very careful to not cross that stitch line that you can kind of see right there. And but stitching very, very close to it to make this all work. And then with the self-enclosed seam finish, which is turned in on itself, looks great from the outside, totally not noticeable. This is a very, very tiny seam finish, and it looks really pretty from the inside. It did require a lot of pinning, and I did press. But which of these 3 seam finishes will I use on the armhole of my Matisse Liberty dress? If you guessed faux French seam, you're right. Because while a regular French seam would work well for lawn, a faux French seam will work just as well. And this fabric is super lightweight. It might add a little tiny bit of bulk, but that will add some crispness and definition to the shoulder, which I think will work perfectly with these long, flowy sleeves. Now that you know how to make your armholes look beautiful, let's keep going with the inside of our garments. There is a great video about facings coming up next. You totally want to check this out, and I'll see you over there.